evening. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Silverstein annual lecture that the Center for Genetic Medicine puts on. This lecture series is funded by a generous gift from the Herman and B. Silverstein Foundation, who provides funding to the Center for Genetic Medicine here at Northwestern University to help promote education and understanding among the general public of genetics and the implication of genetics for medicine and for the general advancement of science. Funding for tonight's lecture is also provided by the CLIMB program, which is the Collaborative Learning and Integrated Mentoring in Biosciences program, which receives money from the National Institutes of General Medicine, which is in turn receiving funding from the IMSD program, which is the Initiative for Maximizing Student Diversity. And diversity, I think, is something that only begins to describe the background of our speaker tonight. Mr. Enriquez got his Bachelor of Arts and his MBA from Harvard University, both with honors. But after graduating from Harvard, he has followed anything but a typical career progression. What he has done is always interesting and always something that has impact in the world. And he has done things ranging from being the economic advisor to Mexico's Secretary of State, to participating in Craig Ventnor's voyage of discovery that went around the world sampling genomes of bacterial species throughout the world. He is on an advisor or on advisory boards to multiple institutions and companies, and he himself has founded a number of biotech companies and venture capital firms specializing in biotechnology. And on top of all that, he is a prolific author. He has written several books and multiple key articles that have challenged how people think about the future and the role of education and the role of science in the development of societies. So it is with great pleasure, and I think it is our honor to have Mr. Juan Enriquez talk to us tonight about the future of genetics, genomics, and sciences in society.
So on a night when everybody's watching the World Series, despite the fact the Red Sox aren't in it, I want to make this a little bit informal. And basically, I want to give you three different ideas. And we'll just make this lecture very simple. Instead of giving you a 3-hour-long detailed lecture on genetics, we'll simply talk about three ideas. The first is that code drives all wealth. Simple enough idea. Second is that code keeps evolving. And the third idea is that we're transitioning from reading life code to writing life code. And those are three pretty simple ideas, but if I'd been sitting here in 1970 and I told you the same thing, then the third idea would have been we are transitioning from writing in ABCs to writing in ones and zeros. And that would have been a reasonably large idea. And if you'd been a student here and if you'd paid attention, you maybe would have gone off and founded Microsoft or Netscape or one of these other little tiny things. So the reason why all of you are sitting in a genetics lecture instead of watching the World Series is because this life code is transitioning. And let's make it visual. Okay, so this is what we do that animals don't do. We write on cave walls. Because we write on cave walls, we can learn a lot about what was happening in Argentina 2,000 years ago. So this is the kind of fish we eat. This is how we cook it. This is how we dress. This is how many of us there are. This is how we do music. There's actually a lot of data transmitted from a long time ago to us today, and that's enough to generate a tribe, not an empire. The reason it only generates a tribe is because to get code, to get information, you have to physically move to the cave wall. When you put that code into a standard language, then all of a sudden two things happen. One is they can read it in Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, And the second thing that happens is you can move it because you put it on papyrus and clay tablets. Because you can move it and because it is standard code, you can have a holy book. You can have a customs treaty. You can have textbooks. You can have contracts. And those things become mobile, and because they become mobile, all of a sudden you can have a great big empire instead of just a tribe, because you can transmit code. Then, of course, you transmit code in movable type. You have huge explosions of libraries, you have huge explosions of books, you get enormous amounts of homework, you get a whole series of work, and contracts, and laws, and magazines, and stories about Britney Spears. Until these folks come up with this little device. Now, this little device doesn't look like much. It's a piece of quartz crystal attached to a little tiny paperclip. But the reason why this device is important is because it can do exactly two things. Current, no current, light, no light, yes, no, 1, 0. By the way, 3 people won the Nobel for that particular device. So that's the first point contact transistor, and it allows you to write sentences that look a little bit like those. Pretty simple sentences. Okay, I pull out my little BlackBerry, which hopefully I turned off, and I send you the first line of code, and you get something on your BlackBerry or your phone that says, I love you. I'm in a bad mood, I send you a different message on this thing, you get the second line of code, it says, I hate you. So the difference between love and hate is pink or green, right? And what you've done here, which is really interesting, is all of a sudden you've collapsed every word written and spoken in English into 2 letters. And every word written in Spanish has gone into 2 letters instead of 29. And Chinese and Cyrillic and Aramaic and Egyptian and every language on the planet. Plus every bit of music and every tonal scale. Plus every photograph. Plus every video. Plus every film. And what that means is that, you know, if you came here 20 years ago and you wanted to study, you had to go to the library here and pick out the books from the stacks. And today you have access to a library that's larger than the school library in your dorm room. And that's what it means to transition in code, and that's how people get rich. And the difference between rich and poor today is, do you speak that code or don't you speak that code? Now, if that stuff is so powerful, and if that stuff is so important, why weren't people speaking this code? Well, because this is what 5 megabytes looked like in 1956. Okay, let's put that in context. This wonderful thing is now a camera, as well as a phone, as well as my agenda, as well as my email. So if I take this thing and I go like that, and take one photograph, I've just used up 5 megabytes. And it only cost me $1 million in 56, right? So it wasn't terribly practical, because if I wanted to take a second picture, I need to spend another $1 million. But because this stuff doubles in power and halves in price every 18 months, it doesn't take very long before you get to a stage where that thing has more power than the rockets we sent to the moon. So let's look at it in a little bit of a closer time scale. This is the world's most powerful computer in 1996. Okay? This thing stayed the world's most powerful computer for several years, which is really unusual. These things don't tend to stay that powerful. This thing only used 500 kilowatts and another 500 kilowatts just to keep it cool. That is 1996 through about 2000. That's the first terabyte scale processing computer in the world. So you could process 1 trillion floating point operations per second. You can now put one of these things in the little side slot of your computer. Okay, and as this stuff moves forward, and as you can have supercomputers that are running at home, this makes a great big difference in who becomes rich, who becomes poor, what kind of work you do, where you do that work. Now, as you think about this stuff, Go back to those three initial theses. Code is the driver of wealth. As code changes, civilization changes, wealth changes, work changes, how you study and what you learn changes. And the one big point of this lecture is that code has been changing again. And that code is moving pretty quickly. So now what we're beginning to learn is that every living thing is written in 4 letters, in what people call the double helix. Take a sugar phosphate backbone, put little 4 rungs on it, adenine, threonine, guanine, cytosine, and you end up with a structure that codes all life in 4 letters. And if you want to get fancy about it, A equals 0, 0, T equals 0, 1, C equals 1, 0, G equals 1, 1, and bingo, all of a sudden the digital world and the world of life is interchangeable. Anything you can code as digits, you can code as life. Anything you can code as life, you can code as digits. As this stuff goes forward, you begin to learn how to code this stuff by running it through machines. So this is part of the facility where you ended up doing a chunk of the human genome. This required building the 3rd largest private computer on the planet for the private initiative. It required the 4th largest use of electricity in the state of Maryland. It required a warehouse full of these machines. You can now substitute all of that with about 6 machines in a classroom. And these are becoming really large data sets. Okay? And they're accumulating about 50% faster than computers can be built to keep up with that data. And you can write wildly boring books with this stuff. Hundreds of millions of pages every day of A, T, A, C, A, G, 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 G. But now go back to those little 1s and 0s. Okay, if it goes 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, I love you. 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, I hate you. The function fundamentally changes depending on which sequence of 1s and 0s you get. And it's the same thing with an orange, right? An orange executes code, so an orange drops to the ground, kerplunk, and it begins to execute code. A, T, C, A, G, A, that means make a little root. T, C, G, A, make a little stem. G, T, A, C, A, make a series of leaves, make them white, make a series of oranges, repeat sequence. If I change those 0s and 1s from this to that, I love you becomes I hate you. If I change a couple of those ATCGs in an orange, that orange becomes a lemon, becomes a tangerine, becomes a grapefruit. Or it becomes something entirely different, depending on how that sequence is structured. So if you came here tonight to McCormick Auditorium to figure out the secret of life, here it is. And in the measure that we begin to understand life as code, every industry on this planet will change, much as it changed with the digital revolution. And it will change in a pretty fundamental way. And as you're thinking about this stuff, why is it that such small changes can make such a huge difference? Well, let's put it in a context we all know. This is the way we see the world. This particular organization has a slightly different way of looking at the world. They look at it like this. And it's those very small changes in inserts, deletions, mutations of single letters, of genes, of repeats that make a huge difference in how long you live, how vulnerable you are to certain foods or certain pollutants, what kind of cancer you get, whether a medicine works, whether it doesn't work. And yeah, a big chunk of it's environmental, but a whole big chunk of this stuff is how is that life code written and expressed. And very, very small changes can make huge variance, which is why you get evolution, and which is why evolution's not a theory, but something that can be proven. We're just not sure which direction it's taking. This is leading to very strange things. Sex is getting very weird. For your grandparents, there was exactly one way of getting pregnant. Now there are dozens of ways of getting pregnant. And some of these things are evolving in very interesting ways. You're beginning to get these in vitro fertilization clinics, which means maybe you're present at conception, maybe you're not. Maybe conception takes place together, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it takes place in a specific time period, maybe it doesn't. And lest you think that this is stuff that is only happening in the People's Republic of Cambridge, this stuff is beginning to spread pretty widely. And you're beginning to get ads that look like this. Would you like some eggs? Would you donate some eggs? Who would you like those eggs to be from? Would you like somebody who's particularly talented at ballet, at languages, at physics? And where are these strange ads appearing? Well, they're appearing in magazines like The American Way, which is the American Airlines in-flight magazine. And then as you go forward, you're beginning to see articles like this, which for the scientists in the room are intelligible, for most of us are Greek. What is this article arguing? Well, it's arguing that you can freeze sperm, that you can freeze whole bodies of male mice, and that you can produce offspring. So you can have conception in a day, in a week, in a year, or maybe your grandchildren have an offspring of yours. And as this stuff moves forward, then you get articles that look like this. Again, obscure titles. What is this thing arguing? It's arguing that you can have parthenogenesis. What is parthenogenesis? Parthenogenesis is conception without sex. And oh, by the way, you're doing this in primates. And what they're showing is that you can take pluripotent stem cells and create them out of parthenogenesis. So you can create a creature like a primate without any need for a man. Men have become officially useless. Then you move that forward. And you get an experiment like this one about 3 months ago. What did these nice folks do? They took skin cells from a mouse, de-differentiated those skin cells so that the code in those cells did not execute become skin. Instead, they executed a program that says, become an undifferentiated cell that can become any part of your body. Which, by the way, is what all of us in the room were at the moment of conception and for the first 16 divisions. Except that they did it backwards. They took a skin cell and turned it into a cell that acted like it had not been differentiated. Well, that's pretty cool. But the next step was even more interesting, because then they simply built a mouse out of that undifferentiated skin cell. So you can go skin cell to stem cell to mouse, because each of your cells contains your entire gene code. Each of your cells is an operating system that makes copies of you. And you have trillions of copies of you sitting inside your stomach, your gut, your eyes, your nose. Every part of your body has your entire gene code, with the exception of some blood cells. Lest we think that this is high-end technology, this is what a modern gene cloning lab looks like, and it's in Argentina. And after you talk to these nice folks, you go out and you pet this little creature. This little creature has been treated so well that it thinks it's a Labrador retriever. As you're petting this creature, these two guys show up. And you have to ask yourself, why do these two look so much alike? Well, it turns out they're clones. And they look a lot like that one because what these nice folks did is they took part of the gene code out of cells in the ear, inserted that gene code into a fertilized cow's egg, gave birth to two clones. And as this stuff goes forward, this is gene cloning. Vet, left hand way up the back of the cow, holding an ultrasound in his right hand, placing about 60 cloned embryos in the morning I was there. Which is why when you walk out of here, a lot of these guys actually look the same. Because I don't expect to see this in Argentina, I'm taking thousands of pictures with my digital camera till an Argentine cowboy shows up and says, "But Che, why are you taking so many pictures? Don't you realize they're all the same?" Then you get this guy. This guy's interesting because they altered the gene code in the clone. And they altered the gene code to produce a medicine that's used to fight cancer in the cow's milk. So you program the cow as you program a computer to produce a medicine that is used to treat cancer. It's erythropoietin. 20 of those cows substitute for this factory. And how we make things is going to fundamentally change. All of manufacturing is going to fundamentally change, much as it changed with the digital revolution. Now, of course, no self-respecting FDA or American would ever be treated by medicines made in cloned cow's milk, which is why Americans are being treated with cloned goat's milk. This is Genzyme Transgenics. It's got an FDA-approved medicine that is now being used to treat people. And there will be a whole series of farmers out there that are making wonderful organic goat cheese in Vermont. And there will be a few that will be having $20 or $30 million goats. Guess what's going to happen to income in places that have certain technologies and don't? So this stuff sounds a little weird. Now let's talk about what's on the horizon. Because this is just the first stages. This is the reading of the gene code. It's not yet really writing gene code. So far we're at the, you can read a genome, which by the way, the first time that happened was 1995. First draft human genome, 2001. Quasi-final draft, 2003. Really recent stuff. But as this stuff goes forward, then you've got to ask yourself, okay, what happens as you move from reading and Xeroxing life code to writing it? Well, this is much like the first transistor when it becomes something like the stuff you used to play with. So most of you took your little electronics kit and you got your little circuit board and you made a circuit that would allow the light to come on, or a doorbell buzzer, or a little electric circuit that would shock your sister, or something that was fun. Here's what the first transistor looks like. So as you're looking at a transistor that looks like this, this is the first programmable cell. It was done at the Venner Institute by a company that I was one of the founders and funded. And the reason why this thing is interesting is because you can take the gene code out of the cell, insert new gene code, and have that cell become a completely different species. And in highly technical terms, scientists call that a BFD. And as you're thinking about this stuff, the reason why it's important is because it means you can program computers and you can program cells to execute code. Let's take a very specific example of what happens when you can do that. If I had asked you when you saw that first transistor, what difference is this going to make? What's it going to change? It probably would have been slightly hard to predict Google or eBay or Twitter or digital television or all the stuff that we're living with. But let's take a very specific segment and say, all right, what does the ability to program cells look like in terms of bioenergy? And if you talk about bioenergy, a lot of people will think about something that looks like this. let's make gasoline out of corn, ethanol. That is a galactically stupid policy, but for the Iowa primaries. Right? There is a logic to it. It just happens to be a political logic. It's got nothing to do with the logic of creating fuels. But what this is telling you, which is really important, is you can make gasoline out of plants. You can make it out of corn. You can make it out of sugar cane. You can make it out of almost anything you want. And that's actually important, because it tells you the proof of concept is there. What you really want to play with is how efficient are you at making this stuff? Why is it that you can go from plant to gasoline? Well, let's talk about agriculture for a second, and then we'll come back to energy. We've been doing agriculture for a long time, and it's all been about how do you bring enough resources to a given plot of land to concentrate the energy to make that plant. We started out by doing it in cave walls in Australia thousands of years ago, and then we gradually mechanized it. And so we went into water wheels, and we went into a series of other things. And as we got better at mechanizing the stuff, we got bigger plots. We had much bigger output, and it got orderly. And then we started mechanizing it some more. And we started building these machines that would substitute for horses. And we went out, and all of a sudden we had really, really large extensions of plots of land. Why? Because we could bring the water, we could bring the fertilizers, we could bring the trains, we could move the stuff. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. Bigger silos, bigger tractors, till this guy shows up. This guy, I think there aren't that many people who are true heroes. This guy is a true hero. It's Norman Borlaug. One of the things Norman Borlaug did is he came up with the Green Revolution. Because of this, you don't have the types of famines you had in China, in India. In fact, they're exporting grain. There should be statues to Norman Borlaug in the central squares of most of the developing and developed world. Because this guy fundamentally changed the rules of the game. And he didn't do it through brute force. He didn't do it by tougher fertilizers, tougher pesticides, tougher herbicides, bigger silos, bigger tractors. That's not where you got your productivity increase. You got your productivity increase out of biology. Here's what agricultural yields on corn look like. There is almost no increase in productivity between 1900 and 1940. Okay, there were a lot of interstates built, there were a lot of silos built, there were a lot of tractors built, but you didn't get an increase in productivity that was really significant. You really did get an increase in productivity, like a 7-fold increase, between about 1960 and the year 2000. And by the way, that's an increase in productivity that's much faster than the general economy. Why did that happen? Because you took a chemical-mechanical system and you applied biology to it, and the seed became a diskette that can execute 3 crops a year, that can have a much higher yield, that can have salt tolerance, that can have drought tolerance, that can do a whole series of things that increases that productivity on a massive scale. And when you started treating agriculture as a biological system instead of an engineering system, that's where you get amber waves of grain to the point where you have such surpluses that you spend 50% of the budget of the European Union subsidizing agriculture, because you have so much of this stuff. Which of course leads to the question, so what does this have to do with energy? Well, you got to really ask yourself, where does this stuff come from? If you take a puddle of oil, where does a puddle of oil come from? What makes that black soup? That black soup comes out of stuff that looks like this. So if you take this stuff and you rot it under pressure for millions of years and you throw in bacteria and fungi, you get a black soup that looks very much like that. At which point you have to ask yourself, where does the energy in this stuff come from? Well, it turns out that plants are giant solar panels. So the energy hits them from the sun, it grows up the plant, there's enough energy to power the plant, and then there's enough energy left over that if you cut down one of those trees, you can burn the logs in your fireplace. Or you can make a wonderful steak using charcoal. But in essence, what you're doing is you're taking the energy from here and you're concentrating it in organic matter, which is why hydrocarbons are sunlight concentrated in organic matter. Let me underline the word organic, because what it means is that oil and gas and coal are organic biological systems. And we've been treating them like chemical mechanical systems, much as we did with agriculture for centuries. And as you go forward with this stuff, guess what? If you take a photograph of the West Texas oil fields from the air, they don't look that dissimilar from those great big agricultural fields. Because those used to be huge primeval forests that eventually decay into this energy matter. And what we've been doing to extract this stuff is bigger, tougher, deeper, drill under bigger pressure, go several miles into the ground, get the diamond drill bits, put more noxious stuff into the drilling fluids. And if you want to reach an extreme in this stuff, you can go up to Alberta and look at the oil sands, where it takes about 70% of the energy in to output 1 barrel of oil. That's what the logical conclusion of this mechanical chemical system looks like. As you go forward in this stuff, you get a guy like Craig Venter and a guy like Ham Smith together, and you put their brains together, and they create that little blue cell. And the reason why that little blue cell is important is because it starts on the premise that cells can act as hardware and genes can act as software. That means that you can program a cell much as you can program a computer for various purposes. Try and operate a financial system, try and operate an energy grid, try and operate a newspaper, try and operate a classroom. Without access to digital code today, it's really hard to do. Not impossible, but darn hard. Over the course of the next decade, it's going to be harder and harder to operate businesses, even energy businesses, without access to life code. Because once you can program these things, then you can write articles like this. And the basic argument in this article is you can simply assemble an entire genome from scratch, which, by the way, is the largest organic molecule built by human beings. And that's the software. And you can put that software into a programmable cell, and the cell will execute that code. And then the question becomes, what do you want to program cells to do? Because the really neat stuff about this is a hardware and a software that reproduces. No matter how I program my computer, I will not wake up in the morning with 1,000 computers. Live systems are different. Here's an early application of this stuff. If you can program a life form to make a gasoline, like a plant, if you can program a goat to make a medicine, you can also program algae to make a fuel. So instead of waiting for a full cycle to have that corn grow up to make a tiny kernel, to take part of that kernel and make ethanol, you can program the algae to make the ethanol. Who'd be interested in this kind of stuff? Well, it turns out that all of you have been seeing these little ads in the paper by a little startup called ExxonMobil. And they're talking about making algae and algae-powered cars. What's their operating system for doing this stuff? Well, you can't see it, but in here is synthetic genomics as the operating system for this. Because one of the first objectives of programming cells is to make fuels from algae in a undifferentiated way. Why? Because people don't eat algae. It doesn't become a competing food resource. And by the way, you can do it in brackish water. And by the way, you're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and sunlight and making a fuel, which is sometimes called a log, but in this case is called a programmed algae that makes fuel. The reason why this stuff is important is not because we shouldn't be supporting wind power, we shouldn't be supporting solar power, we shouldn't be supporting geothermal power, every alternative out there. The reason why this is important is because this fuel system is so large that oil and gas and coal are going to remain important almost no matter what we do for the next decade, if not longer. And as we transition into a solar system or a nuclear system or a geothermal system or some other system or some combination thereof, it is really important that we understand how to make fuels more efficiently, less carbon exports, and not competing with foods. And right now, what we're doing is we're leaving about 2/3 of the energy in the ground. So you drill a gas well, you drill an oil well, you take a coal seam. You're leaving about 2/3 of the energy in the ground. And it makes a great big difference if you're burning gas or if you're burning coal. And if you can program bugs to eat coal and produce gas, then you take out coal-fired electric plants, which right now are the biggest point source of greenhouse gas emissions on this planet. And oh, by the way, that's the second use of that cell. And we have an agreement with British Petroleum to do that. This is not something that is just going to move across the gasoline systems. This is going to move across the economy in a very broad fashion. These are cells which are programmed to make a biodegradable plastic. 90% of the weight of this cell is making a biodegradable plastic. Who might be interested in such a technology? Well, here's another little startup called DuPont. And what DuPont did is it took all of its petrochemical-based stuff, it sold it off, and now makes all of these new fabrics that make your little tennis shoes and your stretchable, breathable jogging wear in a factory in Tennessee out of stuff that looks like this. And there's other little companies like Toyota that are doing similar things. What powers all this stuff and where it happens depends entirely on brains. This is not an issue of natural resources. It's not an issue of a large country, a small country, north, south, whatever. It's an issue of where do you concentrate brains? What are those brains doing? And it turns out that the centerpiece of that stuff are universities. And as you think about the role of universities and the reason why universities are so important as opposed to just research labs at companies, is because one of the ways in which people are beginning to map knowledge looks like this. See, people were asking the question until about 6 months ago when this article appeared in PLOS, Public Library of Science. How does a person get this idea? And what they were doing in science is they were looking at which articles are you citing. So, okay, you read this, and then you got to this. Why is this map important? Because what this map is telling you is not what are you citing. What this article is telling you is as you go through your computer links, as you get from here to what you're going to cite, what's the path you take? And it turns out in this case that the humanities become absolutely critical connectors of that knowledge base. What you're not seeing on this map is this huge ghetto of science where scientists only talk to scientists, only read science articles, and only get from ecology to toxicology by talking to one another. To get to toxicology, you have to sometimes go through music, you sometimes go through plant biology, you sometimes go through microbiology, you sometimes go through psychology, and public health, well, public health is sitting way up here. It's not sitting next to the sciences. And what that's telling you is if you don't have a large, varied, important community that's thinking in very different ways, that has different foods, that has different ways of learning, that has art and music and literature and other languages and other cultures inside it, it's damn hard to create one of these ecosystems. That's why so many of these countries have created, these wonderful science clusters, but you walk around them, they look like deserts at night. There's no cafes, there's no place to talk, there's no wine bars, there's no exchange of foods, there's no exchange of this, that, and the other, and that's what universities do so well. But it's not just universities. If you want to build some of these clusters, it's absolutely essential to have the right government policies, attract the right brains, and have people who are willing to invest in this stuff. Because if you don't have a venture capital community, then most of your smart brains leave. And it's really important to have that investor community because about 0.02% of the US economy each year is invested in venture capital. But oh, by the way, it's about 11% of all the jobs in the United States and 21% of economic output. This is where you get your Googles and your eBays and your Intels and your Hewlett-Packards and your Amazons and your Home Depots and a whole pile of the rest of the stuff. And if there isn't that link between the university, if the university is so scared of its shadow of, oh my God, I don't want to get into bed with business. I don't want to be seen talking to business. I do only pure research. It's very hard for a community to thrive. Let me give you a specific example. There are probably no population on the planet that are better at life sciences than the Brits. Per capita, smarter than anybody. Which is why you get penicillin developed there, which is why you get monoclonal antibodies, which is why you get cloning, which is why you get, discovery of DNA. But in some of the top universities, there was a priesthood, an ethos that said, we will never sully our hands with business. Not every professor should be in business. Not most professors should be in business. But if a few don't create that bridge between what's being discovered and what's being applied, then all of those industries get built out in the United States, not in Britain. And all those jobs get created in the United States and not in Britain. And that transition is especially important because venture-backed companies created about 81% of the employment in software, 74% in telecom, 59% in networking, and 51% in electronics. So if you would like to have jobs in these fields, you absolutely have to have the right government policies, you absolutely have to back research, you have to back fundamental research, you have to back basic research. That has to be government funded or foundation funded. And then you have to have the universities, and you have to attract the right brains to the universities, but you also need that bridge mechanism. And one of the things that worries me about the Chicago community is it has some of the best universities on the planet. Walk around the universities and count the number of startup companies. And then try the same thing at UCSD, or in Maryland, or in Cambridge. And it really makes a difference to a long-term community, whether it becomes Detroit or whether it becomes Silicon Valley, if you can bridge these things and if you can create that community. And particularly with something as powerful as life sciences or robotics or nanotechnology or the new internet, or the new IT. Look, it doesn't have to be life sciences. I just happen to be biased in that direction. But you can do it with any one of those fields. And if you don't, there are consequences. Countries appear and disappear, and they do so with a singular frequency. 3/4 of the flags, borders, and anthems at the UN today did not exist 50, 60 years ago. As you're thinking about who gets rich and who gets poor, it's whether you make your child literate in some of the dominant drivers of the global economy. Not every child has to be a computer programmer, but you better darn well have some computer programmers somewhere in your community. You better damn well have some people who know robots, and some people who know nanotech, and some people who build universities, and some people who build great restaurants and cafes and wine bars and dancing places and connectors, because that's where a lot of the stuff gets done. Most important room at Genelia Farms, the new HHMI facility, Howard Hughes, has a pool table and a bar, because that's where people in this huge building come together and talk. And that's what powers this stuff. So let's make that the end of the story for now and see if any of you have any questions. Thank you.
Before we move to questions, I'd like to just point out a couple things. One is we are recording this for other people and hopefully our administration will get a chance to look at this, and we'll tell stories later. But we would like questions to be asked with the microphones, and we're supposed to have 2 very helpful people. We do have 2 people with microphones to allow you to get your questions down on the recording. And the other thing, while we're getting that ready, is I'd like to thank a couple people involved in this. I'd really like to thank Anna Shepard and Beth Herbert for organizing this lecture, and also Peter Koch, who's the director of the Center for Genetic Medicine, for organizing the infrastructure to make this happen. Okay, so let's open it up to questions. Could I get you to use the microphone, please?
I would like to know what projects your company is supporting. Some of them.
Sure. So synthetic genomics is one. There's another group called Aileron Therapeutics. And what they do is a couple of very bright chemists, Stan Korsmeyer and Greg Verdeen, came up with a way of stapling peptides. So for non-scientists, let me brutalize and simplify. When you look at a picture of a cell or a model of a cell, often you have these little squiggly things that look like slinkies. And those little slinkies, the shape truly matters because they act like keys to make something happen or not happen. If a key has the wrong shape, it simply doesn't happen. And what these 2 characters were able to do is they were able to come up with the equivalent of a staple so the shape is maintained. And the reason why that's important is because it allows you to drug the inside of cells. And to make a long story short, the largest healthcare financing in Q2 was a financing of that company that we led, and the 4 people who came in with us were Novartis, Roche, Glaxo, and Lilly. And it's important because it gets around a whole pile of, it does 2 things. One is it adds a whole pile of pharmaceutical targets that are druggable, and it gets around most pharmaceutical patents, which a couple of people might think is important. That would be a second example. A third example would be, we've gotten very interested in cancer therapeutics. And the reason why it's important is because what we've been doing is we've been going out and looking for the latest and the greatest in terms of cancer therapeutics. And usually that involves finding a new drug, and that's only about $1 billion in 14 years. Sometimes it can get shortened to 7 years and a few $100 million, but it is still a long, painful slog. And what this guy, who's a very smart guy, Sal Salamone, came up with is a way of figuring out that the way you react to chemotherapy really depends on how you absorb it, on your metabolism. So think about it in these terms. If I look at a hamburger, I get fat. But I have a whole pile of friends who can eat a dozen hamburgers and nothing happens. It's the same thing with chemo. There are some people who will take a dosage of chemo and it will stay in their bloodstream, and there are people who will just metabolize it and it'll go out. And right now we prescribe most chemo based on body weight. So you come in, you're sick, they put you on a scale, and they tell you weigh X pounds, here's your dose. That is really stupid. And what this guy came up with is an idiotically simple idea. Instead of looking for the next cancer medicine, what he said is, how quickly does your body absorb that? How effective is that stuff in your body? And that does two things. One is you can take existing generic cancer medicines and have a really significant improvement over the newest, latest, greatest whiz-bang medicine. There's one out there that's selling $1 billion worth. That will increase your life expectancy off of colon cancer by about a month and a fraction. And that's only a $50,000 increase in the cost of treatment. If you take the existing generic drug, 5-FU, and you simply get the dosage right per person, you increase that by about 8 months for $5,000. So just getting the dosage right is going to change clinical trials, and it's going to change how long each of us lives. And you can see that spreading out across a whole series of things. But anyway, those are 3 examples of the kinds of things that we get excited about. I mean, look, our job as VCs, it's like Christmas every day. Because the smartest people in the world show up and they say, I've got a dream of building a company that looks like this. And sometimes you can make it happen. And it's really cool. I mean, it's just fun. Shoot.
Okay. Actually, I wanted I was thinking about the last part of your talk, and which had to do with the connection with venture capital, and I think in general connection between academia and money. And your implication was that in US universities, or some US universities like here, there is not enough of it. And okay, I'm coming from a different country, I'm just a visitor here. I mean, but even in my country where we have even less of that, not to a large degree, I somehow feel it is too much in many ways. So which means my point of view is quite the opposite. I mean, all the examples which you mentioned, let's take, for instance, communications.
Mm-hmm.
The internet started in pure academia. And it was only fairly late in the game, and then it was supported by government, DARPA. I was part of this program. And then, only then, it somehow, maybe it took something like 10 years before things started moving towards more commercial and sort of mass applications. If you talk about transistors, it's true that this was Bell Labs, but this was Bell Labs at the time where, in fact, they just let people do whatever they wanted. And since then, Bell Labs completely changed in style, and no transistors came around. If you talk about, let's say, all these advances, which are wonderful, really, in life sciences and molecular biology, we were discussing, all the potential, also this started with pure research. And I would say that only lately, so it seems to be always the case that universities who are engaged sort of in pure undirected research are probably better in starting and pushing these really new ideas to some point. And when you talk about a later stage of applications, then maybe these things are important. But if you became too commercialized, then I think the danger is that we are not going to get any new, really important new ideas. Because, and there is a lot of pressure in American universities right now, because in fact we are under pressure to come with very quick things, and things that do not happen this way. You know, if I have to get a grant, I have to supply some product in a year or so, intellectual product or something like that.
I don't think we disagree on anything.
Okay, good.
I mean, look, my time horizon is, can I take something to market 3 to 5 years? And I understand that doesn't fit most drugs. That doesn't fit, I mean, it certainly doesn't fit DARPA. It certainly doesn't fit the internet. But there's an inflection point where there's been enough basic research done that it comes time to commercialize and scale. And that's where this bridge is really important, right? And the universities, I mean, it's a tragedy that we lost Bell Labs because Bell Labs acted like intellectual venture capitalists, and they had that time horizon. In a sense, it was acting like a university. Now, I don't want every professor at a university to spend most of their time on building companies. I don't even want them to spend probably the majority of the faculty. It's actually very hard to get faculty that are really good at building businesses. And if you actually map where most businesses come out of universities, they come out of very few labs. And they tend to attract the graduate students that do it. But since we're on the topic, let's get a little more specific about what happens and doesn't happen. So here's the top 500 companies in life sciences. And there are states that are way up there, and there are states that aren't. And one of the interesting questions, and I started thinking about it coming here, is why is that number 0.03 per 100,000 businesses in this state? I'm not being critical of a specific university. I'm simply saying there's an ecosystem here that for some reason is not generating, despite the hospitals, despite the traditional pharmaceuticals, despite the brains that are here, which are really an extraordinary concentration. I mean, most countries would want to have one of the universities you have here. But the output in terms of companies, despite having the Searles and despite having the Pfizers and despite having this, that, and the other, is simply not there for some reason, and it's an interesting question, why not? And then as you go into VC investment, here's what VC investment looks like. And again, this should be a magnet for VC investment because you've got so many smart people with so many smart ideas.
It's interesting that this came up because I was going to ask you to expound on this. You mentioned the importance of the political environment. Mm-hmm. And you're not in Illinois, and so just from a lifetime of living here in Illinois, there certainly is not a political environment supportive of biotech. That would be that would be the conclusion I would come to after living here for a long time. I did graduate work at the UC schools, UC Irvine. The impression there is that Illinois is a, excuse the term, hick state. It's not on the coast, either of the coasts, and it doesn't have the biotech companies. And at the time, when I first heard those comments, I thought, they don't know where they're coming from. When I returned to Illinois, I kind of got my head turned around and thought, you know what, if perception becomes reality, then this is what is becoming reality in Illinois. And it's very unfortunate because we do have the universities, we do have the labor market. Do you have any suggestions? And of course, take this from the point that we do have a state legislature that can't seem to get anything done if there's not money going into their own pockets. We're also in a county that has huge political problems. So any suggestions for what we can do in Illinois to overcome the image, first of all, around the country, and to encourage the political powers to support tech companies?
Well, look, I mean, we can all despair and figure out all the reasons why something shouldn't work. Entrepreneurs don't think like that. I mean, I can give you a million reasons and a million ways to lose money. We're really good at it. The interesting question is not, can't you do it? It's how can you get it done? And the tradition of corruption in Illinois is not new, right? I mean, there's an interesting history here of governance, non-governance. But there's also an extraordinary tradition of innovation and adapting new technologies and showing new technologies and being proud of new technologies. And some of the greatest buildings on the planet were first built here by using new technologies and showing the rest of the United States what would happen. A lot of the financial innovation, a lot of the agricultural innovation, a lot of the building innovation. The World's Fair showcased a whole pile of stuff that changed the US economy. So if you have that tradition despite the disgovernance, why is it that today it is so hard to generate some of these startups? And you can always explain it through bad governance because everybody thinks, oh my God, the government has never been as bad as it is today. And that's true across history. I don't think that's the variable. I mean, I think it's something that makes it harder for it to happen, but it shouldn't make it impossible for it to happen. And as you think about that, I mean, look, the city of Cambridge, Mass. Tried to ban all genetic engineering. Wow, think of what that would have done if that had continued forward. But it still happened. And Silicon Valley happened in an odd way because of a nasty human being. So first, the nasty human being's mother got sick, so he went to take care of her in an orange grove. And he was a smart scientist, so he founded Fairchild Semiconductor. And he was nasty enough that almost everybody left the company and started their own companies. And that's where Hewlett and Packard get together, and a whole pile of that industry comes together, and it's almost an accident. But it's an accident that is a hell of a lot more likely to happen if you have a good university next to you, if you have a faculty that a small part of that faculty is oriented at translational application of this stuff, if it's a place that prides itself on the success of those who start stuff. I mean, there's a couple things I love to do. I love to walk around universities and count startups. I also love to go outside the computer science and chemistry departments and count the number of BMWs or Ferraris, right? And if they're all bicycles, it's unlikely you're going to want to go and do business there. It's a different ethos, and that's fine. I mean, I'm not, that's what you'd like to do. You get people who are really important telling our graduate students, anybody who goes out and builds a business is wrong, stupid, in the best of cases, and da-da-da-da-da. And that's what happens to the community. Now, when that happens, what tends to occur is those communities usually have the wealth to be able to say that, because you're sure not hearing that at the IITs in Mumbai or Bangalore. And the second thing that's happening is usually those dominant industries remain dominant until they die, which is part of what happened to Detroit, because if we'd gone to Detroit 50 years ago, by far the leading edge technologies on the planet for a whole series of things, for electronics, for metalworking, for paint, for this, that, and the other would have been in Detroit. But you don't grow that parallel ecosystem in this stuff. You marginalize Ann Arbor at the cost of funding Detroit. And you don't make Ann Arbor that extraordinary center, and you don't take the Van Andel Institute in Grand Rapids, Maryland, and build it up, and you don't build up that whole system in Holland, Michigan that has a pile of the patents on flowers in the world, and you don't make that the center of economic growth. And then the car system collapses and there ain't nobody home. And it's that Schumpeterian creative destruction of stuff, of being able to go through these waves, that really makes a difference. And I think, Chicago's doing all right in this stuff. But you really have to think over the next few years, what happens if the universities don't become real engines of wealth creation locally? Because they are globally, right? I mean, I can guarantee your students are going out and they are doing extraordinary things throughout the world. It simply doesn't happen to be startups here. And sometimes that can have consequences.
I think one of the issues is, for instance, let's try to compare Chicago with the Boston area. I mean, people say about corruption and bad governance and things like that. I mean, Boston doesn't have a better history than Chicago, right? Mayors in prison and all of that stuff. So I think one of the points is that, you know, if we look 30 years ago at Northwestern, it was not as good a university as it is now. And really, the University of Chicago didn't have much competition. And I think Northwestern has been improving dramatically, and the fact that there has been competition is actually making most of them better. And I think that is paying off. If you look at 10 years ago, no big centers were coming to Chicago. There were systems biology centers, 10 funded around the country. We got one, the only one that is not in the coasts. So these things take time to build. Mentalities take time to build, and the idea that we are not satisfied with where we are and want to do better take time to happen. And I think that Chicago is in a place right now where the tide of not being a place where innovation and new companies are started is about to change, because the institutions are getting better, and that means that maybe more attention about the intellectual abilities here, and then the funding will occur. So I think that you have to fight for it, and you have to work to be noticed, and I think that things in Chicago are going that way right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, look, Boston has an unfair advantage because of its weather. But other than that, and the Red Sox, you know, I think you and I absolutely agree, which is it really makes a difference if you bring 100 or 1,000 brains into an ecosystem like this. And if you bring those 1,000 brains in, it really makes a difference if 50 or 100 of those 1,000 brains translate that into some type of a local economy ecosystem. And I think, you know, what's stunning to me, and I didn't realize this before I was invited to give this lecture, is this disconnect that there is here between this extraordinary brain power and creativity and innovation and the nitty-gritty, nasty application of some of this stuff, which not everybody likes to do, not everybody should do. But just as you need computer programmers and digital literate people in a society that also should have ballet and museums and art, you also need these nasty business people. And if you don't have them, it's darn hard to maintain the university endowments and the museums and the restaurants and some of the cultural stuff. And I'm always fascinated when I go to some places where I get berated in some European places by academics who tell me, how dare you come and bring the word money into this stuff? And you know, the next question is, well, how are you funded? Well, I'm funded by the Wellcome Trust. What the hell do you think Wellcome was? And why don't you have any more Wellcomes? Right? Why aren't you generating that stuff? And what happens if you don't generate that stuff? And look, I'm going overboard in making the argument here. And I'd probably make a different argument at some other universities because I think they've become too translational, next week, next month, driven by the tech transfer office. That's not what you want either. But I think right here in Illinois at this point, with some of the support you have in the federal government and some of the critical hires you've made here, you might want to think about some of the stuff. And look, there are initiatives. The Chicago Biomedical Consortium that was funded by the Searle family. It's bringing together UC and Northwestern and University of Illinois, and some of the agricultural stuff going on at Champaign-Urbana and some of the internet stuff going on at Champaign-Urbana. Look, you start networking that stuff, it gets interesting. So the critical mass is here. It's a question of what's the detonator. Or there's a different strategy, right? Which is to say we are going to remain a pure academic and we're going to keep what we have because we think it's really valuable. But just make it as a conscious decision. Don't do it by accident. Right? I mean, if that's what you want to do and that's going to be your differentiator and that's what this place is going to stand for, do it right.
On another side of the coin completely, you were talking about the pharma companies and the fact that the old or the present method of drugs being 7 to 14 years and enormous expenses. Now with this new genomes and writing codes, will we see a complete difference in the pharma companies and therefore much less expense of drugs, taking it down to a very practical nature?
My advice, don't hold your breath. No, I think there's zero chance of that because we've come up with this really stupid policy that drugs should never hurt anybody. Let me explain that one. Okay? The Europeans have taken this to an extreme in some places. They've put in place something that sounds absolutely logical and reasonable. You should not be allowed to sell something that hurts human beings. They call that the precautionary principle, and the second corollary to the precautionary principle is you should prove to the regulatory authorities that you are not going to hurt human beings before you are allowed to sell X widget on the market. Well, hell, who's going to disagree with that? But there's that small matter of practical stuff. Number one, there's never been a technology invented by human beings that has not hurt somebody. Number two, you would not, under that standard, be allowed to build a staircase. You would not be allowed to drive a car. And if you take the regulatory authorities at the FDA, you literally would not be allowed, under prescription, to use table salt. Try taking table salt through an FDA process and watch what would happen to table salt. Right? Literally, it would not be approved. And so we set up the standard where we say, oh my God, 3 people got hurt by this. And you shut down a company. Now, what you're doing there is you're saying, okay, the cost of approving a drug is going to go from $100 million in 3 years to $1 billion in 14 years. And we're measuring how many people get hurt right here. But we're not measuring how many drugs don't come to market. We're not measuring how many people don't get treated over those 14 years. And that's a number that I can almost guarantee is a whole lot larger than the number that you're looking at the end. So the primary driver of inefficiency today in the pharma markets, yeah, look, I can bitch about pharmaceuticals all day long if you want me to. And I can tell you horror stories about some of the things that some of these companies have done. But for the most part, the people who are working there, particularly in the research organizations, actually want to cure stuff. And it drives them absolutely ballistically crazy to have to jump through these crazy hoops in an attempt. I mean, I think we should have a rolling admissions process, and you should be able to take stuff off, and you should diagnose stuff better, and you should be allowed to do a whole series of things, but we should be measuring the costs of not acting as well as acting. And so I don't think that there's going to be a whole pile of medicines that all of a sudden come to market because of these new technologies in the United States. And in the same way as you can offshore any automobile industry if you increase the cost of your products and decrease the output, it is not inconceivable that will happen with pharmaceuticals, which would be really serious because the US has about 5,000 patents, which is about 6 times as much in life sciences as the nearest competitor anywhere has. So it's the US's race to lose. But it's possible. You know, you can get Blagojevich running the FDA or something. Last question. Shoot.
Kind of different question. Going back to that graph you had that connected the different areas of studies, what have you found to be the influence of, I guess, an interdisciplinary education and in terms of like the influence they have? And then what studies do you find to be most influential or most important in terms of like bright or creative ideas?
Look, I'm the wrong person to ask. I studied originally government and economics. And I finished that and got lost. And then started thinking about why countries appear and disappear, and studied business and international finance and finished that. And then continued thinking about why countries appear and disappear, and eventually got to technology, and eventually got to genomics, and eventually got there early enough that I could learn something, because the field wasn't huge. Half of what a graduate student learns today is going to be obsolete by the time they get their PhD. Now, what's really important about this stuff is we're going to double the amount of data generated by humans in the next 4 years across history. And what that means in terms of disciplines is that a whole pile of disciplines that didn't exist when a lot of you were in college all of a sudden have exploded. And you have departments of nanotech. Didn't exist when I was in college. Have departments of robotics. Well, it was marginal when I was there. I thought the artificial intelligence department was going to be huge. Doesn't really exist. Right? So some things that you really expected to be there came to be, and some didn't. Now, what does that mean for you as an academic or you as a business person? It means that instead of despairing about a lot of this stuff, this is the greatest single smorgasbord banquet any human generation has ever been offered. Because now it doesn't depend on whether your country has a big library. You can go online and access all of MIT's courses in Vietnam as long as you've got access to an internet connection. It means that you can go and look at TED videos or whatever the hell and catch some of the smartest people in the world teaching you. It means that you can go into a whole series of places and work on education in a very different way. It also means the way that professors teach better get smarter for a lot of them. Because that competition, which used to be the professor in the next door classroom, all of a sudden just became a whole lot wider. And the way we teach is going to change, and I'd look very carefully at what happened to newspapers if I were in the education business. And what that means for you is, what you have to do is you have to figure out, how do I learn stuff? Who do I get mentored by? How do I find smart people who can work with me, train me, teach me? And what's the most interesting thing that I can do for the next decade? And then at the end of that decade, ask yourself, do I want to continue to do that next decade, or do I want to do something different? And the wonderful thing is you will have 50 alternatives to go play with, some of which didn't exist, as long as you know how to learn. So it's the people who are at this university that are going to teach you how to learn, and that's what you're going to take away. It's not the specifics on the stuff. Yeah, you got to know some of the specifics, but more and more you can look that up. As long as you know what the rules are, as long as you know how to edit information. And that'll be a very different world. I mean, the way we're learning already, I think those of us who are of a certain age, which was pre-digital when we went to school. I mean, look, I think the first portable PC when I went to business school. It was a suitcase, and it was 64 KB, little yellow screen. But eventually you have smart kids and they teach you stuff. Just learn it and enjoy it. There's two things in life that matter: Nike and Nissan. Just do it and enjoy the ride. Thanks.